Chapter 13. Elizabeth. Elizabeth closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, taking a few deep breaths to try and calm her racing heart. Carl had been looking at her as if he wanted to kiss her, and she wasn't sure she would have minded if he had. However, she wasn't ready for that, was she? It had been less than 2 weeks, and she knew that the day she let him kiss her, she had better be prepared for the rest of her wifely duties. So she'd kept her distance. But every day she felt herself becoming more attracted to Carl. She liked how he read to her from the Bible after dinner. She enjoyed watching him enjoy her food. And now he was willing to help her open a dress shop to fulfill her dream? What kind of man did that? But she knew that answer. It was not only in his words just now, but in every one of his actions over the past several days. He wanted to provide for her, but he also wanted her to be happy, and he was willing to lose her help at the farm to make that happen. How had she gotten so lucky? Not only had she escaped Jacob, but she'd married a man better than she could have ever asked for. Jacob. As his name registered in her head, her smile faded. It didn't matter how much Carl supported her, she couldn't open a store because she couldn't chance Jacob finding out about it. She doubted Sage Creek would care much, but what if a journalist came through and wrote about the store? Word might travel back to Chicago and reach Jacob. Of course, that assumed that a journalist would find the store an interesting story and write about it. It further assumed that said journalist would write a big enough piece for word to travel east. It then hinged upon whether Jacob would read or hear about the story, and finally it relied on Jacob being able to determine that it was her store. She didn't even know if he knew that she liked to sew, and when she looked at all the steps that would have to be met, it did seem far-fetched that opening a store would lead to her demise. So could she do it? Could she take a chance? She wanted to open a shop with all her heart, and now she had not only the encouragement of a friend, was it too early to call Emma that? But the blessing from her husband. So why was she hesitating? Was she so afraid of failure that she was terrified to even start? Was she so fearful of a far-fetched scenario that she would let her dreams die? Was she so reluctant to have a real marriage with Carl that she would give up her desires to remain not alone, but lonely for the rest of her life? No, she wasn't. Her father had taught her better than that. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth pulled open the door and walked back into the living room. Carl's face registered his surprise, but he said nothing as he waited for her to speak. "I wasn't completely honest with you a minute ago. I would love to open a store, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid it will fail, and I'm afraid that the man I ran from in Chicago will find me if I do." Carl crossed the room and took her hand. For a second, Elizabeth worried he would pull her into an embrace, but as if sensing her unease, he merely led her to the couch. "What man?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "When my father died, he left a man to look after me, Jacob Canfield. Unfortunately, he was not the good man my father thought he was. He forced me to work in his saloon, though only as a waitress," she said, dropping her eyes. "Still, I knew I couldn't stay, so I ran away. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you earlier, but I was afraid that you wouldn't want to marry me if you knew." Carl placed a hand under her chin and lifted her face to his. "I'm sorry you had to go through all of that, but I'm glad it led you here, to me. We are not defined by choices in our life made for us by others. We are not even defined by choices we make ourselves. We always have the opportunity to change and grow, and with God's help, we can become the people He planned us to be. I don't know if opening this store is God's will for you, but it seems like it's been a desire on your heart for a while, so we can pray about it, and if it is God's will, He will not only provide a place for you, but will protect you if this man ever does happen to find you." Elizabeth felt her protective shell begin to splinter. For so long, she had built up walls to keep others out so that she wouldn't have to feel the pain of losing someone again. But she hadn't realized until just this moment how utterly lonely she was. After the death of her mother, her father had been enough. But now with him gone, she needed someone someone to talk to hug her, to tell her everything would be all right, even if it wasn't. Elizabeth placed her hands on Carl's, removing them from her face so she could hold them in her lap. "Thank you for being so understanding. I had no idea what to expect when I came out here, but you have been more than I could ask for." She felt like she should say more, but no more words would come, so she simply stared at him and he returned her gaze. Then, slowly, he moved closer until his lips were mere millimeters from hers. He was waiting for her to pull back, to tell him this wasn't okay, but she wasn't going to do that. She still wasn't sure she was ready for everything else, but she was definitely ready for this. So she squeezed his hands to let him know, and he closed the distance. His touch was soft and not demanding, but Elizabeth's heart began to hammer in her chest all the same. She had never been kissed by a man and hadn't known what to expect, but even her wildest imagination could not have created this, the flood of emotions coursing through her body. Before she was ready for it to end, Carl pulled back and smiled at her. "I've got to finish my work tonight, but I can make some time tomorrow. How about we go into town and see what's available?" "I'd like that." Carl squeezed her hands again and then stood, giving her a final glance before exiting the homestead. For a moment, Elizabeth simply sat there, trying to process her emotions. But then she stood and decided to make the best dinner Carl had ever had. The rest of the evening passed by as usual, but it felt different after the kiss they'd shared. And though Carl did not ask about joining her in the bedroom tonight, Elizabeth thought about it for the first time since she'd arrived.